Ancient India left behind stories of weapons so terrible that modern readers have compared them to nuclear bombs. A flash brighter than the sun, heat that consumes armies, cities said to fall beneath divine fury. In the margins of these tales, later writers have pointed to radiation, vitrified sand, poisoned lands, and ruined bodies, as if the epics were not mythology at all, but a memory of some forgotten war fought with impossible technology. It is a haunting claim, and if even a piece of it were true, it would change how we imagine the ancient world. But this story asks for patience. The old texts are not simple records, and legends do not surrender their meanings easily. Between poetry and evidence, between sacred imagination and modern fear, there is a long distance. Tonight we walk that distance carefully. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are filled with weapons that do not behave like ordinary weapons. They are invoked through mantra, granted by gods, restrained by moral law, and feared even by the warriors who possess them. Over time, these Astras have become the center of a modern mystery. Did ancient poets describe divine power, or did they preserve distorted memories of technologies now lost? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. There are ruined cities in this investigation. There are flying palaces, burning skies, and claims that stretch from Sanskrit epic to Mesopotamian gods. But the first question is quieter, and more important. What do the ancient sources actually say, and what has the modern imagination placed inside their fire? To enter the world of India's Great War epics, we have to slow down before we interpret anything too quickly. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are not simple books in the modern sense. They are not novels written by one author at one desk, nor military reports from a battlefield, nor secret technical manuals disguised as poetry. They are vast cultural oceans, composed, recited, expanded, preserved, reworked, and revered across centuries. They carry theology, royal memory, family tragedy, political instruction, philosophical debate, ritual imagination, and scenes of warfare so immense that later readers have sometimes felt they must be describing something more than myth. That feeling is understandable. In these texts, battles do not merely wound armies, they shake the earth. The sky darkens, the wind changes. Warriors call down weapons associated with gods, elements, and cosmic forces. Chariots flash across the battlefield. Missiles blaze like suns. The bodies of men, elephants, and horses fall in numbers too large for ordinary realism. At moments, the violence seems to press against the limits of language itself, as if the poet is trying to describe destruction that cannot be measured by human experience. And this is where the modern mystery begins. When a reader shaped by the 20th century encounters descriptions of unbearable brightness, scorching heat, poisoned aftermath, or cities ruined in an instant, the mind may leap toward Hiroshima, Nagasaki, mushroom clouds, radiation sickness, and the terrifying vocabulary of nuclear war. We are not neutral readers. No generation reads ancient catastrophe with innocent eyes. We bring our own fears to the page, and since 1945, one of humanity's deepest fears has been the sudden destruction of civilization by weapons of unimaginable power. But the epics were not written in the shadow of the atomic age. Their images were born from a different world, one where divine order, ritual power, kingship, cosmic balance, and moral responsibility shaped how violence was understood. The Mahabharata, traditionally associated with Vyasa, is often described as one of the longest poems ever composed. Its central story is the war between two branches of a royal family, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, culminating in the catastrophic battle at Kurukshetra. But to call it only a war story is almost to miss its character. It is a universe of stories within stories, discussions of dharma, political counsel, mythology, pilgrimage, metaphysics, grief, vengeance, and renunciation. It contains the Bhagavad Gita, where the battlefield becomes the setting for a profound teaching on duty, action, and the nature of reality. The Ramayana, traditionally attributed to Valmiki, moves with a different emotional rhythm. It follows Rama, Prince of Ayodhya, his exile, the abduction of Sita by Ravana, and the war in Lanka. It is a tale of kingship, loyalty, devotion, loss, and the burden of ideal conduct. Its battles are grand, but they are framed by questions of righteousness, honor, and the fragile demands placed upon those considered noble. Both works contain warfare, but their warfare is rarely just warfare. A modern military text asks, what weapon was used? What range did it have? What material damage did it cause? An epic asks different questions. Was the warrior entitled to use it? Did the act preserve order or violate it? Was victory worth the moral cost? Did rage override restraint? Did a king defend justice, or did he become another source of ruin? That difference matters, because much of the ancient imagery that now seems technological was originally embedded in a moral and cosmic framework. A weapon in the Mahabharata is not simply a device. It may be a gift, a discipline, a vow, a curse, a burden, or a test of character. A warrior's ability to wield it depends not on engineering, but on spiritual qualification, training, mantra, and lineage. Its danger lies not only in its physical effects, but in whether the person who invokes it has the wisdom to stop. This is where speculative readings often flatten the material. They take the brightness, the heat, the scale, and remove them from the world that produced them. What remains can look strangely modern. But once the language is returned to its epic setting, its meaning becomes more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing. Because the ancient poets did not need uranium to imagine annihilation, they knew cities could burn. They knew drought could empty a land. They knew plague, famine, siege, dynastic collapse, and the ruin that follows when rulers lose restraint. They lived in cultures where oral memory could preserve the trauma of conflict for generations, reshaping it into legend, ritual, and moral instruction. A battlefield might become cosmic, not because it recorded a nuclear event, but because war itself felt like a tear in the fabric of order. The Mahabharata especially seems haunted by that recognition. It does not celebrate war in a simple heroic mode. Even when its heroes win, the victory tastes bitter. The dead are too many. The families are broken. The throne is stained by the price paid to secure it. The epic repeatedly pauses to ask whether righteous war can remain righteous once it has devoured nearly everyone it was meant to protect. This tone is important. Many ancient heroic traditions glorify combat, and the Mahabharata certainly contains valor, skill, and martial grandeur. But beneath that grandeur is a kind of exhaustion. It is a poem deeply suspicious of human ambition. Again and again, its characters know what is right and still fail to do it. They are trapped by vows, pride, insults, loyalty, revenge, and the machinery of social obligation. By the time weapons of cosmic scale enter the story, they feel less like convenient tools than extensions of a civilization already losing control of itself. That may be why modern readers find the epic so unsettling. The destruction is not random. It is the final expression of accumulated choices. The Ramayana, meanwhile, gives us a different vision of catastrophic conflict. Its war against Ravana is more clearly framed as a battle against adharma, against disorder and violation. Yet even there, the scale is magnified beyond the ordinary. Armies of Vanaras and Rakshasas clash. Heroes leap impossible distances. Celestial weapons appear. Divine beings watch. The conflict is both political and cosmic, earthly and symbolic. To a literalist reader hunting for machines, these scenes can become evidence. Flying chariots become aircraft. Astras become missiles. Blazing impacts become explosions. But epic poetry often works by intensification. A king is not merely strong, he is mountain-like. A warrior is not merely fast, he is wind-like. A weapon is not merely dangerous, it burns like the sun, roars like thunder, falls like death itself. This does not mean the descriptions are meaningless exaggerations. On the contrary, their exaggeration is part of their meaning. Epic language enlarges human action until its moral consequences become visible. A single act of rage can darken the world because, in the moral imagination of the poem, rage really can darken the world. A weapon can seem cosmic because it threatens not just bodies, but the order that allows life to continue. Still, we should not dismiss the possibility that these works preserve memories of real conflict. They likely do, though not in the clean way modern reconstruction would prefer. Scholars have long debated the historical layers behind the Mahabharata war, the social world reflected in the epics, and the processes by which oral traditions became monumental literature. The evidence is complex, and exact historical claims remain disputed. What we can say with more confidence is that the epics preserve the anxieties of societies familiar with warfare, political fragmentation, shifting kingdoms, ritual authority, and the fragility of dynastic power. Memory, after all, does not behave like an archive. It selects, it magnifies, it moralizes, it turns defeat into warning, victory into burden, and trauma into story. Over centuries, a remembered conflict may become the stage on which a civilization thinks about everything it fears losing. That is one reason the nuclear interpretation that became so seductive in the modern era. It offers a dramatic solution to the strangeness of the texts. If the ancient poets described weapons like suns and lands made barren, perhaps they witnessed advanced technology. Perhaps civilization rose higher than we know and destroyed itself. It is a powerful idea because it combines awe with dread. It makes the ancient world seem both more advanced and more like us. But seductive ideas are not always careful ones. The responsible approach is not to mock the question, nor to accept it too easily. The better path is to ask what the text actually says, what language it uses, what genre it belongs to, and how ancient audiences may have understood it. Only then can we ask why modern readers have heard, in these old verses, the echo of modern weapons. And perhaps that is the most revealing point. The epics may not be records of nuclear war, but they do understand something that nuclear war made impossible to ignore. That human beings can create forms of violence greater than their wisdom. They knew in their own language that power without restraint becomes a curse. They imagined warriors capable of invoking forces they could barely control. They understood that victory can leave a world uninhabitable in the moral sense, even when the fields still grow. So when we read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana beside modern fears, the question is not simply whether ancient India had atomic bombs. The evidence does not require that conclusion. The more interesting question is why these poems, composed in a world without modern physics, could still speak so directly to an age terrified by its own inventions. The answer may lie in the memory of catastrophe itself. Not one specific explosion, not a hidden laboratory beneath a ruined city, but the deeper human memory that civilization is never as secure as it appears. A kingdom can fall. A family can destroy itself. A weapon can outgrow the hand that raised it. And once a culture has imagined that, it does not need machines to sound modern. To understand why the weapons of the Indian epics have so often been compared to modern superweapons, we have to begin with a distinction that is easy to miss in translation. An astra is not simply a weapon. It is not just an arrow, a spear, a missile, or a blade with an unusual name. In the world of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, an astra is a weapon empowered by invocation. It belongs to a universe where sound, discipline, divine favor, and moral worth are not decorative ideas. They are forces. A warrior does not merely pick up an astra from an armory. He must be taught it, granted it, remember it, summon it, and, just as importantly, know how to withdraw it. That last detail matters. Modern readers often focus on the destruction, the fire, the brightness, the dreadful scale. But the ancient storytellers were just as concerned with restraint. The terrible weapon is never only a spectacle. It is a test of the person who holds it. In the epics, astras are usually associated with archery, but they are not ordinary arrows. The physical arrow can be understood almost like a carrier, a visible gesture through which an invisible force is released. A warrior recites or remembers a mantra. He invokes a deity, a cosmic principle, or a power taught to him by a master. Then the weapon becomes something more than wood, metal, and feather. It becomes fire, wind, water, sleep, delusion, serpents, lightning, or annihilation. This is why reading astras as ancient missiles can be tempting, but also misleading. A missile is a machine. It works because of engineering. It can be manufactured, stored, transported, and launched by anyone trained in its system. An astra, in the epic imagination, is bound to the inner condition of the wielder. It depends on initiation, memory, self-control, spiritual authority, and the permission of forces beyond the human world. That does not make the descriptions simple or childish. Quite the opposite. The astras reveal a sophisticated moral imagination. These stories are asking what happens when power becomes too great for ordinary judgment. They are not technical manuals disguised as mythology. They are meditations on force. Consider the Brahmashira, perhaps the most famous of these divine weapons. Its name connects it with Brahma, the creator, and in epic tradition it carries an aura of supreme danger. It is not treated like a weapon to be used casually in battle. It is reserved for extreme circumstances, and even then, its use is surrounded by anxiety. The Brahmashira is often described as having devastating power, capable of overwhelming enemies and scorching the world around it. Later readers, especially after the 20th century, have noticed the language of heat, light, and desolation, and have drawn comparisons to nuclear weapons. But within the epic's own logic, The Brahmashira is not powerful because it contains a hidden reactor or some lost mechanism. It is powerful because it draws upon cosmic order at a scale that human warfare should not normally touch. Its danger is religious and ethical before it is physical. The Brahmashira, or Brahmashirastra, is even more terrifying. In many tellings, it is considered a weapon beyond even the Brahmastra, associated with a force so extreme that its release threatens more than the immediate battlefield. Its very name suggests something like the head of Brahma, though traditions vary in how they explain it. What remains consistent is its atmosphere of prohibition. This is not the weapon of a normal warrior's pride. It belongs near the edge of catastrophe, and the epics understand that edge very well. The most chilling weapon stories are not merely scenes of triumph. They are scenes of hesitation, warning, and aftermath. The greatest warriors are not admired simply because they can unleash devastation. They are honored because they know when not to. This is one of the most important differences between the epic imagination and many modern speculative readings. Modern interpretations often ask, how advanced was the technology? The text is more often asking, what kind of person can be trusted with destructive power? That question runs through the training of warriors. Astras are taught by gurus, sages, and divine figures, not distributed like standard military equipment. Knowledge itself is guarded. A teacher may refuse to give a weapon to a student considered morally unstable. A warrior may receive a weapon only after austerity, devotion, service, or proof of discipline. The ability to invoke an astra is therefore not just a skill. It is a mark of spiritual and social qualification. Of course, the stories do not pretend that qualification always prevents disaster. That is part of their seriousness. The world of the Mahabharata is full of gifted people who know the rules and still violate them. Knowledge does not guarantee wisdom. Training does not erase anger. A man may learn how to summon a power and still fail to master himself. The Narayanastra gives us another revealing example. Associated with Narayana, a form of Vishnu, it is described as a weapon of overwhelming force, one that cannot be defeated by ordinary resistance. In the Mahabharata, its danger lies partly in the fact that fighting back makes matters worse. The way to survive is not heroic defiance, but submission. Warriors must lay down their weapons and cease resisting. That detail is often overlooked because it does not fit the modern fantasy of ancient super technology. If the Narayanastra were simply a missile, the instruction to survive by surrendering would make little practical sense. But as a sacred weapon operating in a moral universe, it is deeply meaningful. Violence feeds violence. Ego invites destruction. The only defense is humility. In the middle of a war epic, that is a startling lesson. Then there is the Pashupatastra, associated with Shiva in his form as Pashupati, Lord of Beings. It is among the most feared weapons in the tradition, often described as capable of destroying creation if misused. Arjuna's acquisition of it is not presented as a workshop demonstration. It comes through encounter, devotion, and divine testing. The weapon is not merely handed over as a piece of equipment. It is entrusted. Entrusted is the right word, because the epics repeatedly frame these weapons as moral burdens. This is where the ancient material becomes more interesting than the modern conspiracy version. If we reduce astras to machines, we may actually make them smaller. We turn a rich symbolic and ethical system into a puzzle about hardware. The question becomes whether ancient India had advanced ballistics, aircraft, and energy weapons. But the texts themselves are working in another register. They imagine power as something woven into speech, ritual, divinity, and character. They are less concerned with the metal casing of the weapon than with the soul of the person releasing it. This does not mean the battle descriptions lack physical intensity. They are often vivid, even overwhelming. The Agnyastra invokes fire. The Varunastra invokes water and can counter fire. The Vayavyastra calls upon wind. Other weapons create darkness, confusion, sleep, showers of arrows, or serpent-like attacks. There is a whole grammar of cosmic opposition. Fire answered by water, wind by mountain-like steadiness, illusion by knowledge, divine force by divine force. In this sense, the battlefield becomes a map of the universe. The warrior is not only fighting another human being, he is calling elements, gods, and principles into motion. Warfare becomes cosmology dramatized through combat. That may feel strange to a modern audience because we tend to separate categories that ancient literature often joins together. Religion over here, warfare over there, poetry in one room, technology in another. But in epic thought, power is not divided so neatly. A mantra can be weaponized. A vow can alter destiny. A curse can wound more deeply than iron. A blessing can protect an army. Words have consequences because the cosmos is imagined as responsive to rightly ordered speech. This is why mantras matter so much in the Astra tradition. They are not passwords in a mechanical system. They are sacred utterances tied to discipline, memory, and authority. To know the mantra is not merely to know syllables. It is to possess a relationship with a lineage of knowledge. It means the weapon has been transmitted, not stolen in the ordinary sense. And yet the epics are fascinated by the possibility of knowledge in the wrong hands. A warrior who receives a weapon through deception, pride, or incomplete instruction may gain power without the maturity needed to use it. The danger is not only technological escalation, it is moral imbalance. That is one reason the comparison to nuclear weapons, though historically unsupported as a literal claim, has had such a long afterlife. Nuclear weapons also forced humanity to confront a power that exceeded ordinary warfare. They also created a world in which the ability to destroy became inseparable from questions of restraint, command, legitimacy, and survival. When modern readers encounter the Brahmastra or Brahmashira, they recognize the shape of that fear, even if the ancient text is not describing modern physics. The resemblance is psychological, not necessarily technological. This distinction allows us to take the epics seriously without forcing them into a modern mold. The ancient poets did not need uranium, reactors, or missile silos to imagine unbearable destruction. Human beings have always understood fire, drought, plague, famine, and the ruin of cities. They have always known that rulers can become intoxicated by power. They have always feared that a single decision, made in rage or pride, might harm generations not yet born. The Astras give mythic form to that fear. They are dazzling because they are more than weapons, and dangerous because they are more than symbols. In the world of the epics, they stand at the meeting point of devotion and violence, wisdom and ambition, divine order and human failure. Their stories remind us that the most frightening weapon is not always the one with the greatest destructive yield. Sometimes it is the one placed in the hands of someone who believes he has the right to use it. And as the Mahabharata moves toward its darkest moments, that concern becomes harder to ignore. The question is no longer simply what an Astra can do. It is whether anyone, however heroic, can be trusted with a power that once released may not obey the limits of human intention. By the time the Brahmashira enters the story, the Great War is already over. That detail matters. It does not appear at the height of heroic battle, when armies are still arranged in glittering formations and warriors are announcing their lineages beneath the open sky. It comes afterward, in the wreckage. The drums have quieted. The great champions are dead. The field of Kurukshetra has become less a battlefield than a moral landscape, a place where victory has lost its shine and survival itself feels compromised. This is one of the reasons the episode feels so disturbing. The most terrifying weapon in the Mahabharata is not used to win the war. It is summoned when the war has already consumed almost everything worth winning. The figure at the center of this moment is Ashwathama, the son of Drona, one of the great teachers of arms. He is not an ordinary villain. The epic rarely works in such simple colors. Ashwathama is a warrior shaped by inheritance, humiliation, grief, and rage. His father has been killed through a morally complicated deception. His side has collapsed. The world he understands has been stripped away, and what remains is vengeance without strategy. In the night, according to the epic tradition, Ashwathama enters the sleeping camp of the Pandavas and slaughters those he finds there. Among the dead are the sons of Draupadi, young heirs of the victorious line. It is not a clean act of war. It is a violation of the warrior code the epic has spent so much time defining, testing, and breaking. By dawn, the victory of the Pandavas has acquired a new wound. Their enemies are defeated, but their future has been attacked. Ashwathama is pursued. Arjuna, guided by Krishna, confronts him. And it is here, after the great war has ended, that the story opens the door to something even more frightening than battle. Ashwathama invokes the Brahmashira. The name itself carries weight. The Brahmashira, often understood as a more dreadful form related to the Brahmastra, is associated with the creative power of Brahma, but turned toward annihilation. Later explanations describe it as having the force of Brahma's 4 heads, a weapon of such severity that it should almost never be released. It is not a machine in the modern sense. It is not described as a device assembled from metal, fuel, and circuitry. It belongs to a world where weaponry is inseparable from mantra, discipline, cosmic authority, and the moral fitness of the person who calls it forth. That difference is essential. Modern readers sometimes rush toward technological comparison because the described consequences feel familiar. Unbearable heat, blazing light, the danger of widespread destruction, the possibility that land itself may suffer afterward. But in the epic's own imaginative universe, the horror of the Brahmashira is not that it is advanced engineering. The horror is that it is power severed from wisdom. Ashwathama can invoke it, but he cannot properly control it. Arjuna answers with the same weapon, not because the story delights in escalation, but because within the logic of the epic, only a comparable force can counter it. 2 ultimate weapons now face each other. The scene is not merely a duel, it is a crisis in the structure of the world. The conflict has moved beyond armies, beyond kingdoms, beyond personal revenge. The danger has become disproportionate to any possible human purpose. At this point, the sages intervene. Vyasa, and in some tellings Narada as well, appear between the 2 forces and command the warriors to withdraw their weapons. This is one of the most revealing details in the entire episode. The epic does not allow the Brahmashira to simply explode so that the audience can marvel at destruction. Instead, it pauses the action at the threshold. The true drama becomes restraint. Arjuna is able to withdraw his weapon. He has the discipline, the training, and the inner command required to call back what he has released. Ashwatthama does not. Or perhaps, more precisely, he lacks the purity and mastery required to reverse the act. He can unleash catastrophe, but he cannot undo it. That is a profoundly modern fear, even though the text is ancient. Many societies have imagined terrible weapons. Fire from heaven, divine arrows, plague-bearing spears, cursed swords, thunderbolts, storms summoned by gods. But the Brahmashira episode expresses something more specific than the fantasy of power. It imagines a weapon whose use creates a problem larger than the user. It imagines a human being borrowing cosmic force in a moment of emotional collapse. It imagines knowledge without the character needed to bear it. This is where the comparison to nuclear weapons becomes tempting. Not because the Mahabharata secretly describes uranium enrichment or missile systems. It does not. But because the moral shape of the fear is recognizable. The 20th century taught humanity that a single decision made by a small number of people under conditions of fear, pride, or strategy could injure the world far beyond the battlefield. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, descriptions of unbearable radiance and poisoned aftermath could no longer be read innocently by modern eyes. We began to see our own anxieties reflected backward into older texts. But reflection is not the same as evidence. The Brahmashira does not need to be a literal nuclear weapon to be terrifying. In some ways, reducing it to that may shrink the episode. A nuclear reading makes the weapon a technological puzzle. What did the ancients know, and where did the machinery go? The epic's own concern is wider and more uncomfortable. It asks what happens when a warrior's interior disorder becomes an exterior catastrophe. It asks whether training in violence can ever be separated from training in self-command. It asks whether victory matters if the future is burned in the process. Ashwatthama's final act makes this painfully clear. Unable to recall the Brahmashira, he redirects it. Not against an army, not against a fortress. He turns it toward the wombs of the Pandava women, aiming to extinguish the lineage itself. In many tellings, the unborn child Parikshit, carried by Uttara, becomes the focus of this attack. Krishna intervenes to preserve or restore the child, ensuring the continuation of the line. This movement from battlefield to womb is one of the darkest turns in the epic. It transforms destruction from military violence into generational violence. The target is no longer the enemy standing before you, armed and named. The target is possibility, continuity. The people who have not yet had the chance to become guilty of anything. That is why the language surrounding these weapons can feel so severe. The epic is not simply imagining a bigger explosion. It is imagining the death of inheritance. A world where rage is so complete that it reaches forward in time. Some traditions attached to the Brahmastra and related weapons describe consequences that sound environmental. Ruined lands, years without rain, the destruction of crops, devastation that lingers beyond the instant of impact. These descriptions are often cited as evidence of radiation. The comparison is understandable, but it should be handled carefully. Ancient literature frequently uses drought, barrenness, failed harvests, and cosmic disorder to express moral and spiritual rupture. When a king fails in duty, the land suffers. When dharma collapses, nature itself responds. This is not unique to India. Many ancient cultures imagined a deep bond between human conduct and the health of the world. Still, even after we make those cautions, something striking remains. The Mahabharata is unusually alert to the danger of excessive force. Again and again, its greatest warriors possess weapons they are warned not to use casually. Power is not treated as neutral. It stains the one who misuses it. It requires eligibility, restraint, and a clear mind. A weapon may be divine, but the person holding it is still human. And that is the problem. Ashwatthama's punishment reinforces the point. Krishna condemns him to a long, tormented existence, marked by isolation and suffering. Whether one reads this as theology, poetry, or moral psychology, the meaning is hard to miss. The man who tried to erase the future is denied ordinary closure. He becomes a living remainder of the war, a figure who cannot fully rejoin the human world. The legend of Ashwatthama's wandering has grown over centuries. In parts of India, stories still circulate that he moves through remote places, wounded and deathless. Those later traditions are not evidence for ancient superweapons, but they are evidence of something else: the emotional force of the character. Ashwatthama survives in cultural memory because he embodies a fear that does not age. The fear that someone entrusted with terrible knowledge may be broken enough to use it. This is the heart of the Brahmashira episode. Not proof of a forgotten nuclear age, but proof that ancient storytellers understood a terrifying equation. Intelligence plus power does not equal wisdom. A civilization may possess rituals, laws, teachers, lineages, and sacred language, and still produce a moment when one wounded man reaches for the thing that should never be touched. The Mahabharata does not treat apocalypse as an accident. It treats it as a moral failure, and that may be why the episode continues to feel so strangely close. Not because it describes our technology with scientific precision, but because it understands the human weakness that makes any ultimate weapon dangerous. The Brahmashira is frightening because it is invoked at the exact moment when judgment has collapsed. It is the weapon of a world that has won its war and lost its restraint. The strange power of these ancient passages is not that they describe a machine. It is that, to a modern reader, they sometimes seem to describe an aftermath, a light no one can bear to look at, heat spreading across the battlefield, warriors collapsing in terror, the unborn threatened in the womb, lands cursed with barrenness, weapons so dangerous that even the heroes who possess them are warned not to use them lightly. Read after 1945. Such images begin to vibrate with a new meaning. The mind reaches, almost instinctively, toward Hiroshima, Nagasaki, radioactive fallout, the white flash, the invisible poison. And once that comparison has been made, it becomes difficult to unsee. But this is where the investigation has to slow down, because resemblance is not the same as identity. Ancient poetry can sound modern without being modern. A metaphor can feel technical because we have inherited a century of technical nightmares. The question is not simply, do these descriptions remind us of nuclear war? Some of them do. The deeper question is, what did these images mean inside the world that produced them? The Mahabharata and Ramayana are filled with extreme language because they are not modest works. They are epics of cosmic proportion. A battle is rarely just a battle. It is a disruption in the order of the universe. When heroes draw divine weapons, the text does not merely report damage. It describes reality reacting. Winds change. Fires blaze. Rivers tremble. The sun darkens. Animals cry out. Celestial beings look down in fear. That kind of language belongs to a literary universe where moral action has physical consequences. A king's pride can disturb the heavens. A warrior's vow can alter destiny. A weapon is not only a weapon, it is a test of whether human beings deserve the power they have been given. Still, there are passages that continue to trouble modern readers, and understandably so. Among the most frequently discussed are the accounts of great Astras producing blinding radiance, unbearable heat, and destruction across wide areas. Some translations describe weapons blazing like the sun, or like many suns, or filling the sky with terrible brilliance. In other moments, the use of a divine weapon threatens drought, failed crops, or destruction not limited to the immediate battlefield. The Brahmashira, in particular, is surrounded by a sense of contamination, not in the modern scientific language of radiation, but in the older language of cosmic imbalance, sterility, and curse. This is the point at which many modern theories make their leap. Light becomes nuclear flash. Heat becomes thermal radiation. Barren land becomes fallout. Threatened pregnancy becomes genetic damage. The comparison is emotionally persuasive because the images line up just enough to feel uncanny. But if we look carefully, the fit is not as exact as it first appears. Ancient literature across many cultures uses overwhelming brightness as a sign of divinity. Gods shine. Weapons shine. Enlightenment shines. Anger shines. Kings shine. In Sanskrit epic and devotional literature, radiance is not merely visual. It is a sign of power, rank, purity, terror, or spiritual force. A weapon that blazes like the sun is not automatically being described as a bomb. It may be described as divine. Fire, too, is more than combustion. In Vedic and epic imagination, fire is sacrifice, judgment, purification, hunger, and destruction. Agni is a god as well as an element. To be consumed by fire can mean physical death, but it can also carry ritual and moral meaning. When a divine missile burns armies, the point may be less about thermodynamics than about irresistible cosmic authority. This does not make the descriptions tame. They are meant to feel terrifying, but they are terrifying in the grammar of the epic world. Consider the recurring image of the battlefield as apocalypse. When great warriors fight, the sky fills with omens, the earth quakes, the directions become confused, the natural order seems to fail. This is not unique to Indian literature. Greek epics, Mesopotamian myths, biblical prophetic texts, and later medieval war poetry all turn battle into a kind of miniature end of the world. A great war is described as if creation itself were under strain. That matters, because one of the mistakes in modern speculative readings is to treat ancient poetic exaggeration as if it were a damaged technical report. If a text says the world shook, it may not be reporting a measurable seismic event. If it says a weapon shone like the sun, it may not be describing a specific energy yield. If it says warriors were scorched, blinded, or overcome, it may be invoking the expected effects of divine wrath. The epic poet is not writing for a weapons laboratory. He is writing for an audience trained to hear moral scale through cosmic imagery. And yet, caution cuts both ways. We should not flatten the texts into just myth either. That phrase is often used carelessly, as though myth means nonsense. In fact, myth is one of humanity's most durable ways of thinking about danger. The descriptions of Astras may preserve, in stylized form, memories of real weapons, real fires, real sieges, real environmental disaster, or real fear of warfare escalating beyond control. Ancient India knew war. It knew drought. It knew cities could fall, lineages could vanish, and victory could taste like ruin. The epics may not describe nuclear weapons, but they do understand catastrophic power. The most revealing passages are often not the ones about explosions, but the ones about restraint. Again and again, the use of supreme weapons is limited by warning, lineage, and moral law. A weapon may be invoked only against a proper enemy. Some should not be used against ordinary soldiers. Others require the user to possess the knowledge to withdraw them. The truly terrifying warrior is not merely the one who can unleash destruction, but the one who cannot control what he has unleashed. That anxiety feels modern because it is modern, but it is also ancient. After the atomic bomb, 20th century readers gained a new vocabulary for an old fear: power without wisdom. It is no accident that the Mahabharata became newly resonant in the nuclear age. Robert Oppenheimer famously turned to the Bhagavad Gita when reflecting on the first atomic test. And although his quotation is often simplified in popular memory, the association helped bind Sanskrit epic imagery to the atomic imagination. From that point on, many readers approached the ancient texts already carrying the image of a mushroom cloud. The result was a kind of feedback loop. The epics described blinding light and world-shaking weapons. Modern readers living under the shadow of nuclear war recognized something familiar. Alternative historians then treated that recognition as evidence and repeated the most dramatic lines, sometimes without context, sometimes with embellishments. This is where several popular claims become fragile. You may have seen quotations online claiming that ancient Indian texts describe soldiers whose hair and nails fell out. Birds turned white. Food became poisoned. Or people washed themselves after exposure to mysterious weapons, as though decontaminating after radiation. Some of these lines are difficult to trace in the exact form in which they circulate. Others appear to be stitched together from different passages, loose paraphrases, later retellings, or modern interpretations rather than clean translations of a single ancient source. That does not mean every comparison is dishonest. It means the chain of transmission matters. A line quoted in a modern paperback, repeated on a website, then copied into hundreds of videos, can begin to feel ancient simply because it has been repeated often enough. But repetition is not provenance. The unborn child motif is more solid, though still often misunderstood. In the Mahabharata, Ashwathama's weapon is connected with an attempt to destroy the heir in Uttara's womb. Krishna intervenes to preserve the child, who will continue the lineage. To a modern reader, harm to the unborn may suggest radiation-induced genetic damage. But within the epic, the meaning is dynastic, moral, and cosmic. The attack is horrifying because it targets the future itself. It is an assault not only on a body, but on continuity, kingship, and the fragile survival of a shattered world. That distinction matters. Radiation damages the future biologically. The epic weapon threatens the future ritually and morally. The two ideas can echo each other without being the same claim. Barren lands and long droughts also require care. In ancient thought, improper violence often brings ecological consequence. A king's failure can produce famine. A curse can withhold rain. A sin can stain the land. The Mahabharata's fear of devastated territory belongs to a worldview in which ethics and environment are linked. Again, modern readers may hear fallout. Here, ancient audiences may have heard adharma, disorder, spreading from human action into the natural world. Perhaps the most important lesson is that the language sounds like radiation because radiation has changed us. Before the 20th century, a blinding flash in an epic might have evoked lightning, divine fire, the sun, or the sacrificial flame. After the atomic bomb, the same image arrives carrying photographs of burned cities and test explosions over deserts. We are not neutral readers. We bring our own ruins to the page. That does not weaken the epics. If anything, it shows their depth. A shallow story belongs only to its own time. A great epic can be reinterpreted by later ages because it speaks in images large enough to survive translation, trauma, and fear. So when the ancient texts describe weapons that blaze, poison the moral order, endanger unborn life, and make even the victors tremble, we do not need to force them into the shape of nuclear war to take them seriously. The warning is already severe. The language may sound like radiation, but what it most clearly reveals is something older than radiation: the dread of a weapon that exceeds the judgment of the person holding it. If the weapons of the epics pull the modern mind toward fire, heat, and annihilation, the Vimanas pull it upward. They invite a different kind of fascination, not the terror of a weapon too powerful to control, but the old human dream of leaving the ground. A shining craft moves through the sky. A king is carried over forests, rivers, and cities. A divine being descends from above. Armies look upward and see something that belongs not quite to earth, not quite to heaven. It is easy to understand why, in the age of aircraft, rockets, satellites, and military drones, these passages have been read with new intensity. But the first thing to say about the word Vimana is that it did not begin as a blueprint. In Sanskrit literature, the meaning shifts with time and context. It can refer to a palace, a temple tower, a heavenly vehicle, a throne-like aerial car, or a splendid conveyance associated with gods and kings. That range of meaning matters, because modern claims often treat the word as if it always meant a mechanical aircraft in the modern sense. Ancient literature is rarely so narrow. A single word can carry architecture, ritual, prestige, and imagination inside it. The most famous Vimana is the Pushpaka Vimana of the Ramayana. It belongs first to Kubera, the lord of wealth, and is later taken by Ravana, the powerful ruler of Lanka. After Ravana's defeat, Rama uses it to return to Ayodhya with Sita and his companions. In the epic imagination, Pushpaka is no ordinary vehicle. It moves through the air. It is radiant, beautiful, spacious, and responsive. Some accounts describe it as capable of carrying many passengers, moving according to the will of its occupant, and shining with almost celestial grandeur. For a modern reader, those details are tempting. A vehicle that flies, a craft that responds to intention, a royal transport that crosses vast distances. It sounds at first hearing like a memory of advanced machinery. But if we slow down, the texture of the story changes. Pushpaka is not introduced like an engineered device. The epic does not pause to explain its propulsion system, its materials, its maintenance, its pilots, its fuel, or its manufacture in any technical sense. It is described in the language of splendor and divine status. It belongs in the same imaginative world as celestial weapons, miraculous births, boons from gods, curses, sages, demons, and cosmic vows. To isolate the vehicle from that world and treat it as a misplaced aircraft manual is to remove the very grammar that gives it meaning. That does not make it unimportant. Quite the opposite. The Pushpaka Vimana tells us something profound about ancient ideas of kingship and power. To fly in such a craft is to possess a view denied to ordinary people. It is royal elevation made literal. The ruler rises above the landscape, surveying kingdoms, forests, and seas from a position closer to the gods. Flight becomes authority. It becomes victory. It becomes return. In the Mahabharata, too, the sky is alive with movement. Gods arrive in aerial chariots. Warriors receive divine transport. Celestial beings travel between worlds. Sometimes these vehicles are described with brightness, sound, ornament, or speed. The battlefield is not only horizontal, it has a vertical dimension. The heavens participate in human conflict, and human conflict echoes upward into the heavens. Here again, the modern imagination leans forward. Were these accounts of flying machines? Were the gods remembered pilots? Were celestial chariots a poetic distortion of technology no longer understood? The difficulty is that the texts themselves do not behave like technical records. They behave like epic poetry. They are concerned with status, fate, moral power, divine intervention, and the dangerous intimacy between humans and cosmic forces. A chariot in the sky is not merely transportation. It is a sign that the normal limits of the world have been crossed. That sign appears in many cultures. Greek gods move through the air. The prophet Elijah is taken up in a fiery chariot in the Hebrew Bible. Norse myth gives gods vehicles and animals capable of supernatural movement. In Buddhist and Jain literature, celestial palaces and airborne beings are part of a vast cosmological landscape. The presence of flight in myth does not automatically imply technology. Often, it marks access to another order of reality. And yet, the fascination remains because the descriptions are not always vague. Some passages feel oddly concrete. A vehicle has size. It has rooms. It shines like metal or the sun. It carries passengers. It travels over named places. In later Sanskrit literature, aerial palaces can become elaborate and almost architectural, filled with ornament, platforms, banners, jewels, seats, and chambers. These are not wisps of cloud. They are imagined as constructed things. That is where the interpretive challenge lives. Ancient poets could imagine constructed flight without possessing aircraft. Human beings have imagined flying structures for as long as they have watched birds, clouds, smoke, and stars. A palace that flies is not an engineering report. It is architecture freed from weight. A chariot that moves through the sky is not necessarily a memory of aviation. It is the most prestigious vehicle of the ancient warrior world transferred into the heavens. The chariot matters because it was already a symbol of elite power. In early Indo-Aryan and broader ancient warfare, the chariot represented speed, status, skill, and aristocratic violence. To give a god or hero a celestial chariot was not random decoration. It was a way of saying, this being moves with supreme command. The sky chariot is the war chariot perfected, spiritualized, and enlarged beyond earthly limits. The same pattern appears with weapons. The epic Astras are not guns with missing labels. They are weapons of invocation, moral qualification, and divine relationship. The Vimanas belong to a similar symbolic world. They are not machines anyone can simply build, buy, and fly. They are acquired through divine ownership, supernatural inheritance, conquest, boon or cosmic privilege. Their operation often depends less on mechanics than on worthiness, command, or will. This is one reason modern technological readings can be both intriguing and misleading. They notice the flying object, but sometimes miss the social and sacred structure around it. A Vimana is not just a craft. It is a sign of who has the right to move between realms. Still, by the 19th and 20th centuries, as ancient texts were translated, printed, and read alongside the rise of modern aviation, the old imagery began to acquire a new atmosphere. Balloons, airships, airplanes, and later rockets changed what readers thought was possible. A description that once sounded miraculous could now sound mechanical. The sky had been industrialized. Once humans built machines that could fly, earlier stories of flight became easier to reread as memories rather than myths. This shift intensified in the 20th century. After 2 world wars, after the atomic bomb, after the space race, alternative histories began to look back at ancient texts with a very particular hunger. They searched for traces of lost science. The Vimana became a centerpiece in that search. What had once been celestial vehicles in sacred literature were reimagined as aircraft from a forgotten technological age. One recurring claim is that ancient Indian texts describe Vimanas powered by Mercury, sometimes through a kind of vortex engine. This idea is now widespread in popular discussions, but its textual foundation is far more complicated than it usually appears. The strongest versions of the Mercury-powered aircraft claim do not come directly from the Ramayana or the Mahabharata in the way casual retellings imply. They are tied largely to much later and disputed material, especially texts presented in the modern period as ancient aeronautical treatises. That distinction is essential. If someone says, "The Ramayana describes Mercury engines," we have to ask, where exactly in the epic? In what recension? In what language? With what terms? In many cases, the confident claim dissolves when pressed. The ancient epic may describe a splendid aerial vehicle, but the engine room is usually supplied by modern interpretation. Mercury itself has a long and fascinating history in South Asian alchemical and medical traditions. It was associated with transformation, potency, and esoteric knowledge. In later traditions, Mercury could occupy a place that feels almost magical to modern readers. Fluid metal, dangerous, shining, difficult to control, symbolically rich. It is not surprising that, when modern interpreters began imagining ancient aircraft, Mercury became an attractive candidate for mysterious propulsion. It already looked like science and sorcery at the same time. But attractiveness is not evidence. There is a difference between a culture knowing Mercury, using Mercury in ritual or alchemical contexts, and building Mercury-powered flying machines. The first is well within the history of pre-modern knowledge. The second requires an entirely different category of evidence. Workshops, tools, failed prototypes, technical diagrams, consistent terminology, material remains, manufacturing traditions, or clear instructional texts. For epic Vimanas, that evidence is not present in the way the stronger claims require. This does not mean the stories are meaningless. It means their meaning lies elsewhere. The Pushpaka Vimana, for example, works beautifully within the emotional architecture of the Ramayana. Ravana's possession of it reflects his magnificence and his transgression. He is not a crude villain living in a cave. He is a mighty, learned, terrifyingly capable ruler, surrounded by wealth and power. The flying vehicle helps establish the scale of what Rama confronts. When Rama later returns in that same vehicle, the meaning reverses. What had been a symbol of Ravana's stolen grandeur becomes part of Rama's restoration. The craft carries not just bodies, but legitimacy. That is far richer than simply saying it was an airplane. The same is true of celestial vehicles in the Mahabharata. They often appear at moments when ordinary human categories break down. A warrior is elevated, rescued, instructed, rewarded, or judged. The aerial vehicle marks transition. It tells the audience that a character is moving not only through space, but through moral and cosmic status. Modern technological interpretations tend to flatten these layers. They turn metaphor into mechanism. Sometimes that produces exciting speculation, but it can also make the ancient imagination seem smaller than it was. A culture capable of imagining flying palaces, divine chariots, and sky-born kings was not necessarily writing engineering manuals in disguise. It was thinking about power, distance, transcendence, and the longing to rise above the human condition. There is also a subtle irony here. To insist that Vimanas must have been literal machines can unintentionally underestimate ancient poets. It assumes that technical prediction is more impressive than symbolic invention. But perhaps the more remarkable thing is that these texts understood flight before flight was practical. They grasped its emotional meaning: freedom, superiority, danger, surveillance, escape, divine nearness. Long before airports and contrails, they knew that to command the sky was to change one's relationship with the earth. This is why the Vimana tradition survives so easily in modern imagination. It sits at the crossing point of myth and technology. It gives ancient dignity to modern dreams and modern machinery to ancient wonder. For some readers, it promises that the past was more advanced than we think. For others, it offers a glimpse into how deeply human beings have always wanted to exceed their limits. The responsible path is not to sneer at the fascination, but to discipline it. Yes, the epics describe aerial vehicles. Yes, some descriptions are vivid enough to stir technological comparisons. Yes, later traditions become more elaborate, and modern interpreters have built ambitious theories around them. But what we can say with more confidence is that the major epics present Vimanas as mythic, royal, and divine conveyances, not as clearly documented aircraft built from recoverable engineering knowledge. The dream of flight is ancient. The airplane is modern. Between those two facts lies a wide and tempting space, and many theories have rushed to fill it. But the older stories do not need engines to matter. Their power comes from something quieter and more enduring. The vision of a world where the boundary between earth and heaven is not fixed, where kings and gods move above the horizon, and where human imagination learns to fly long before human bodies do. If the ancient Indian epics gave modern readers the dream of flying palaces and celestial chariots, the Vaimanika Shastra seemed at first glance to offer something even more tempting: instructions. Not just poetry, not just gods crossing the sky in radiant vehicles, but diagrams, materials, engines, protective suits, mirrors, metals with strange names, machines that could supposedly vanish, observe distant objects, disable enemy craft, or travel between land, sea, and air. For those searching for lost ancient technology, it became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Here, they argued, was the missing manual. The bridge between myth and machinery. The proof that Vimanas were not symbolic vehicles of divine power, but engineered aircraft from a forgotten scientific age. And yet, when we follow the text itself, the story becomes much more complicated. The Vaimanika Shastra is not an ancient manuscript discovered in a temple archive, quietly preserved for 2,000 years. Its known history begins in the modern period, in the early 20th century, with a man named Subbaraya Shastri, a Sanskrit scholar and mystic from southern India. According to accounts connected with the text, Shastri received the material through a kind of spiritual revelation or psychic transmission, attributed to the ancient sage Bharadvaja. The verses were then written down by others, and the work eventually circulated before being published in the mid-20th century, most famously through G.R. Josier. That origin does not automatically make the text worthless. Many traditions preserve older ideas through late copies, oral memory, or devotional transmission. A late manuscript can contain old material. A modern publication can sometimes preserve something much earlier. History is not always neat, but the burden of proof becomes heavier. For a work claiming to represent ancient aeronautical science, we would expect some trace of it in older manuscript catalogs, references by medieval commentators, quotations in established Sanskrit literature, or a recognizable place within a technical scholarly lineage. That is where the Vaimanika Shastra begins to weaken. Its textual footprint appears late. Its language and organization do not comfortably match what we would expect from a truly ancient scientific treatise. And its technical content, when examined closely, raises more problems than it solves. This is where the mystery changes shape. The question is no longer simply, did ancient India have flying machines? It becomes, how did a mystical literary tradition of flight become reimagined as mechanical engineering? The Vaimanika Shastra describes several types of Vimanas, often given names such as Rukma, Sundara, Tripura, and Shakuna. In later presentations, these are sometimes treated as aircraft models, as if we were looking at an ancient equivalent of a design catalog. Some are described in ornate or unusual terms. Some are fitted, according to the text, with devices for observation, protection, or movement through different environments. The language can feel wonderfully specific. That specificity is part of its power. A vague legend invites imagination. A technical diagram invites belief. And this is why the Vaimanika Shastra has had such a long afterlife in popular culture. It gives the impression of engineering. It speaks in the tone of classification. It names parts and substances. It breaks the dream into components. To the non-specialist eye, that can feel like evidence of machinery hiding inside mythology. But technical language is not the same as working technology. In the 1970s, a group of researchers at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore examined the aircraft designs attributed to the Vaimanika Shastra. Their conclusion was not gentle. They argued that the craft described in the text were aerodynamically unsound and, in several cases, incapable of flight as designed. The shapes did not suggest a practical understanding of lift, stability, or propulsion. Some designs were, in their assessment, more like imaginative constructions than engineered vehicles. That critique matters, not because modern science is automatically superior in every interpretation of the past, but because a technical claim must eventually meet technical reality. If a text is being presented as an aeronautical manual, then its machines must be judged as machines. Do the designs fly? Do the propulsion systems make sense? Do the materials behave as described? Do the instructions allow reconstruction? In this case, the answer from technical reviewers has generally been no. The famous Mercury engine claim belongs to this same tangled world of interpretation. Across modern alternative history writing, Mercury is often described as the key to Vimana propulsion. Spinning Mercury, Mercury vortex engines, anti-gravity effects, mysterious energy systems. The image is unforgettable. A shining ancient craft, powered by liquid metal, humming above a battlefield or temple city. It sounds like something halfway between alchemy and science fiction. But when we slow down, the trail becomes unstable. Mercury appears in various Indian alchemical and medicinal traditions, where it carried deep symbolic and practical importance. It was associated with transformation, potency, and esoteric knowledge. Some Sanskrit texts do mention machines or devices involving heat, fire, wind, or mercury in ways that later readers have connected to flight. But the modern idea of a fully developed mercury vortex propulsion system is not clearly laid out in ancient sources in the way popular retellings often imply. This is a pattern we have to keep noticing. A suggestive word becomes a mechanism. A metaphor becomes a blueprint. A ritual substance becomes an energy source. By the time the story reaches the internet, the uncertainty has vanished, and what remains is a confident diagram of a machine no one has ever built. The Vaimanika Shastra itself sits at the center of that transformation. It borrows the authority of Sanskrit. It invokes an ancient sage. It speaks about aerial vehicles in structured categories, but its historical trail points toward the modern period, and its engineering does not convincingly support the claims built upon it. Still, dismissing the text too quickly would miss the more interesting story. The Vaimanika Shastra tells us something about the early 20th century, a time when aviation was no longer fantasy. Human beings had begun to fly in machines. Empires were building air forces. The airplane had become a symbol of modern power, national prestige, and technological destiny. In colonial India, as in many colonized societies, there was also a profound intellectual struggle over the past. Was ancient knowledge primitive, as colonial narratives often suggested? Or had India possessed sciences that the modern world was only beginning to rediscover? In that atmosphere, the idea of ancient aeronautics carried emotional force. It was not only about machines, it was about dignity, memory, and reversal. If Europe claimed the airplane as a triumph of modernity, then the Vimana could be imagined as proof that India had dreamed it first, perhaps even mastered it long before. This does not prove the machines existed, but it helps explain why the claim endured. Lost technology myths often arise where cultural pride, real historical brilliance, and modern insecurity meet. Ancient India did possess extraordinary intellectual traditions. Mathematics, astronomy, linguistics, metallurgy, medicine, philosophy, architecture. These achievements do not require imaginary aircraft to be impressive. In fact, the obsession with proving impossible technologies can sometimes distract from the real ones. That is one of the quieter ironies of the Vaimanika Shastra. By trying to make ancient Sanskrit literature look like modern engineering, its defenders may actually flatten the older imagination. A Vimana in epic literature is not merely a vehicle. It is a sign of rank, merit, divine favor, cosmic order, or supernatural movement. It belongs to a world where moral and spiritual power are not separate from physical action. To reduce every flying chariot to an aircraft is to translate poetry into hardware and lose something in the exchange. At the same time, skepticism should not become contempt. The people drawn to the Vaimanika Shastra are often responding to a real wonder in the texts. The old literature does contain astonishing images of flight. It does imagine movement across realms. It does treat the sky as a theater of power. The mistake is not in being fascinated. The mistake is in forcing the evidence to answer a question it was never designed to answer. A careful reading leaves us with a layered conclusion. The Vaimanika Shastra is important, but probably not for the reason it is usually cited. It is not strong evidence for ancient aircraft. It is not a reliable engineering manual from a vanished technological civilization. Its known history is too late. its textual pedigree too uncertain, and its designs too impractical to carry that weight. But it is evidence for something else: the modern reinvention of ancient flight. It shows how myth can be recoded as technology, how sacred language can be made to sound like laboratory language, how a civilization's symbolic imagination can be recruited into modern arguments about progress, pride, and lost power. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals how easily we mistake detail for authenticity. A diagram can feel more convincing than a poem. A Sanskrit term can feel older than it is. A machine described in confident language can seem real simply because it has parts. But history asks for more than atmosphere. It asks for context, transmission, comparison, and evidence that survives contact with the material world. The Vimanas of the epics still hover over the ancient imagination. They remain luminous, strange, and culturally powerful. But the Vaimanika Shastra, when brought down from the clouds and placed on the work table, looks less like a lost manual of aeronautics and more like a modern artifact of longing. A document born from the desire to find engines inside myths and proof inside wonder. There are ruins that become famous because of what archaeologists find in them. And then there are ruins that become famous because of what later imaginations need them to contain. Mohenjo-Daro belongs strangely to both worlds. On one level, it is one of the great urban achievements of the ancient world. A planned city of baked brick, wells, drains, streets, platforms, courtyards, and public architecture rising from the floodplain of the Indus River in what is now Pakistan. It belonged to the Indus Valley Civilization, a world that flourished roughly between the 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, contemporary with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, but still more elusive than either. Its script remains undeciphered. Its rulers, if it had rulers in the way we usually imagine them, left no readable boasts. No long royal inscriptions tell us who conquered whom. No epic poem survives from its own hand to explain what the city meant to the people who lived there. That silence has made Mohenjo-Daro vulnerable. Into that silence, modern legends have poured fire. According to one popular claim, the city was not abandoned through environmental change, flooding, or social transformation, but destroyed in a blast of unimaginable heat. The story is usually told with a familiar set of details. Skeletons supposedly found lying in the streets, as if death arrived in a single instant. Levels of radiation allegedly too high to explain. Vitrified stone or sand said to resemble the aftermath of an atomic explosion, and a ruined urban landscape presented as the archaeological fingerprint of an ancient nuclear war. It is a powerful image, a city before history, struck down by a weapon before its time, a Bronze Age Hiroshima, a warning buried under mud brick. But the difficulty begins as soon as we ask the most important question: where is the evidence? Mohenjo-Daro was rediscovered and excavated in the 20th century, and from the beginning it unsettled expectations. Here was a city with impressive planning, standardized bricks, extensive drainage, and signs of civic organization, but without the obvious monuments that many people expected from ancient high civilization. No pyramids, no giant royal tombs, no carved sequence of triumphant kings. Instead, the evidence spoke in quieter forms. Street grids, craft production, seals, weights, wells, bathing areas, and a built environment arranged with a practical intelligence that can feel almost modern. That modern feeling is part of the problem. When people see drainage channels and baked brick architecture from more than 4,000 years ago, they sometimes rush from admiration into fantasy. If the city looks more organized than expected, perhaps everything else has been underestimated too. Perhaps the missing texts concealed technologies beyond our own. Perhaps the collapse was not gradual, but catastrophic. The gap between impressive and impossible becomes dangerously small. The famous skeleton claim is a good place to begin. Human remains were indeed found at Mohenjo-Daro. Some were discovered in streets or rooms, and early interpretations sometimes described them in dramatic terms. For a time, there were suggestions of massacre, invasion, or sudden violent death. One influential older idea connected scattered bodies with the arrival of Indo-Aryan invaders, a theory that has since been heavily revised and, in its older form, largely rejected. Later study made the picture much less theatrical. The remains did not represent a vast population caught in a single instant of destruction. They were not found as thousands of bodies fused into a final moment. They were relatively limited in number, found in different contexts, and do not provide convincing evidence for a citywide annihilation event. This matters because legends often depend on compression. A few human remains become streets filled with skeletons. Unclear archaeological context becomes people dropped where they stood. An abandoned urban layer becomes a frozen moment of doom. But archaeology is rarely so obedient to drama. Human remains in an ancient city can mean many things. Disturbed burials, later occupation, disease, violence, neglect, or bodies left in a settlement during periods of instability. Without the right context, they cannot be made to testify to a nuclear blast simply because the story is more exciting that way. Then there is the raciation claim. This is one of the most repeated pieces of the Mohenjo-Daro legend, and also one of the weakest. Popular retellings often state that skeletons from the site were radioactive, or that the area showed radiation levels far above normal. But reliable archaeological reporting does not support the idea that Mohenjo-Daro contains evidence of abnormal radiation from an ancient nuclear event. The claim tends to circulate without clear measurements, without secure documentation, and without connection to recognized scientific analysis of the site. It functions less like evidence and more like a modern stamp placed onto an ancient ruin. Once the word radiation is introduced, the imagination does the rest. And this is where the nuclear age begins to haunt the ancient past. Before the 20th century, no one would have looked at Mohenjo-Daro and thought of atomic weapons. After 1945, however, the vocabulary of destruction changed. Blinding light, heat, invisible contamination, poisoned landscapes, cities erased in moments. These became part of humanity's lived imagination. Ancient descriptions of divine fire began to sound technological. Ruined cities became possible crime scenes. Even ordinary archaeological damage could be reinterpreted through the grammar of nuclear fear. The vitrification claim follows a similar path. Vitrified material can be real in many archaeological and geological settings. Intense heat can alter stone, clay, brick, or sand. Lightning can fuse sand. Kilns and furnaces can produce glassy surfaces. Burned forts in various parts of the world show vitrified stone, where timber, wind, and sustained fire created extraordinary temperatures. Meteor impacts can produce natural glass. Industrial activity, even much later activity, can confuse the picture if context is ignored. But at Mohenjo-Daro, the idea of widespread vitrification caused by a nuclear explosion is not supported by credible archaeological evidence. The city was built largely of baked brick, a material already transformed by fire during manufacture. Erosion, salt damage, burning, rebuilding, and exposure can all complicate the appearance of ancient surfaces. To leap from altered material to atomic warfare requires far more than resemblance. It would require a pattern, blast effects, thermal shadows, consistent radiation signatures, impact on materials across a defined radius, mass casualties in proper context, and a destruction layer matching such an event. That pattern is not present. What archaeologists do see is a city shaped by water as much as by human hands. Mohenjo-Daro stood in a dynamic river environment. Flooding was a recurring problem. Some parts of the site show evidence of rebuilding and raising levels over time, as if the inhabitants were repeatedly responding to water, silt, and changing ground conditions. The Indus system was never a static backdrop. Rivers shifted, floods came and went, and settlements across the broader Indus world experienced changing environmental pressures. By around 1900 BCE, many urban centers of the civilization were declining, transforming, or being abandoned. The reasons were probably not simple. Weakening monsoons, altered river courses, trade disruption, changes in agriculture, internal social shifts, and regionalization all likely played roles. That kind of collapse is harder to film in the mind. It does not arrive as a single flash. It creeps. A trade route becomes less reliable. Flood repairs become more exhausting. Wells need maintenance. Administrative habits loosen. Families leave. Crafts move elsewhere. Streets that once carried routine traffic become uneven, then neglected, then buried. Civilization does not always end with a scream. Sometimes it ends with decisions so ordinary that no one writes them down. This is one reason the nuclear story is tempting. It gives the city a climax. A sudden destruction event is narratively satisfying. It has a villain, a weapon, a moment of impact. Environmental change is slower, less personal, and in some ways more disturbing because it resembles problems we know too well. Rivers move, climate shifts, urban systems become fragile. People adapt until adaptation is no longer enough. The archaeological evidence for Mohenjo-Daro points not to one impossible weapon, but to the vulnerability of even a brilliantly organized city when its wider world changes around it. The name itself has helped the legend grow. Mohenjo-Daro is often translated as Mound of the Dead, though it is a modern name, not what the city's inhabitants called it. Still, names have power. A place called the Mound of the Dead almost invites a catastrophe. It sounds less like an archaeological site and more like the title of a warning. When visitors see exposed brick walls under a harsh sun, when they imagine a lost people whose writing cannot yet speak, the absence becomes theatrical. The city seems to be withholding something. But responsible history has to resist being seduced by atmosphere alone. The Indus Valley civilization is mysterious, yes, but mystery is not permission to insert any answer we like. Its undeciphered script does not mean its people possessed forbidden weapons. Its urban sophistication does not require lost nuclear science. Its decline does not need extraterrestrial war or divine missiles translated into modern military terms. If anything, the real Mohenjo-Daro is more interesting without the imported explosion. It shows us a society capable of large-scale coordination without leaving behind the usual monuments of kingship. It challenges the assumption that ancient complexity must look like empire, conquest, or spectacle. That may be the deeper reason the legend persists. Mohenjo-Daro does not fit comfortably into the familiar story of civilization. It was advanced, but not in the way popular imagination expects. It was monumental, but not loudly so. It was powerful, perhaps, but its power is visible in drains and bricks rather than statues of rulers. Because we cannot easily read its politics, its religion, or its final memories, it becomes a screen. Some project apocalypse onto it. Others project utopia. The evidence supports neither extreme. What we can say with more confidence is this. Mohenjo-Daro was not a radioactive ruin left by an ancient atomic war. The claims of nuclear destruction depend on exaggeration, misread context, and modern comparisons that outrun the evidence. The city's story belongs instead to the long and complicated history of the Indus world. A history of water management, urban planning, environmental stress, adaptation, and eventual transformation. And yet the false legend still reveals something true, not about the ancient city, but about us. We are drawn to the idea that a civilization before ours might have reached our level of danger, because it makes our fears feel older, almost inevitable. If they had nuclear fire, then perhaps self-destruction is not modern at all, but a recurring human inheritance. Mohenjo-Daro becomes, in that telling, a mirror disguised as a ruin. But the actual city offers a quieter warning. Not that ancient people had our weapons, not that a lost science burned them away. Rather, that even careful cities, built with intelligence and discipline, can fail when the systems around them shift beyond their control. No flash is required, only time, pressure, and the slow undoing of what once seemed permanent. A strange piece of glass can do something powerful to the imagination. Hold it in your hand and it seems to interrupt ordinary history. It may be greenish, blackened, bubbled, smooth in places and rough in others. It may look as if stone has melted, as if sand has briefly forgotten what it was and become something else. And because glass needs heat, serious heat, the mind begins to reach for extraordinary causes. A fire too hot for wood, a weapon too advanced for its age, a catastrophe so violent that the ground itself changed state. This is where many stories of ancient nuclear war find some of their most persuasive-looking evidence. Not in texts, not in gods or flying chariots, but in objects. Vitrified stone, fused sand, glassy patches in ruins, desert glass scattered across remote landscapes. These things feel physical. They do not sound like poetry. They sit in museums, fields, archaeological reports, and online photographs, quietly inviting interpretation. But evidence is not just the object itself. Evidence is the object in context. A piece of vitrified material, removed from its setting, can become almost anything. In one story, it is the trace of a forgotten weapon. In another, it is the byproduct of a kiln. In another, a lightning strike. In another, a meteor airburst, or a furnace, or a burned fort, or a modern industrial contamination mistaken for something ancient. The question is not whether vitrification exists. It does. The question is what kind of heat made it, when it happened, and whether it belongs to the story being built around it. Vitrification simply means that a material has been transformed into a glassy state, usually through intense heating followed by cooling. Sand can become glass because it contains silica. Certain stones and clays can partly melt. Minerals can fuse, but the temperatures required are not always as unreachable as they seem. They vary depending on the material, the presence of fluxes such as salts or plant ash, the duration of heat, and whether the heat is concentrated in a small space. Ancient people did not need nuclear technology to create very high temperatures. Potters, metalworkers, glassmakers, lime burners, and builders all learned, by experiment and necessity, how to control fire with remarkable skill. This is one of the quiet misunderstandings at the center of the mystery. We often imagine ancient fire as simple: campfires, torches, bonfires. But ancient pyrotechnology was complex. Furnaces for smelting metal could reach temperatures far beyond ordinary domestic fires. Kilns could produce ceramic transformations that appear almost alchemical. Bricks could overfire and fuse. Slag from metalworking could look like volcanic rock or melted stone. In places where people worked copper, iron, glass, faience, or ceramics, strange glassy waste is not a sign of impossible science. It is sometimes a sign of very real craft. And then there are vitrified forts, especially those known from parts of Scotland and elsewhere in Europe, where sections of ancient stone walls appear to have been fused by heat. For a long time, these sites encouraged speculation, even among earlier antiquarians. How could the walls of a fort become glassy? Was this some unknown weapon? Was it a deliberate strengthening technique? Was it ritual destruction? Was it the result of attack? Modern study has not produced one simple answer for every site. That matters. Some vitrification may have resulted from the burning of timber-laced ramparts, where wood built into the wall burned intensely enough, under the right conditions, to fuse certain stones. In other cases, the pattern of heat damage may suggest destruction rather than construction. The type of stone is important. So is airflow. So is whether the burning lasted long enough, and whether the wall's structure trapped heat. The evidence can be technical, uneven, and local, but none of this requires a lost superweapon. It requires the less glamorous, but more interesting, reality that ancient fortifications were often composite structures of stone, earth, and timber. And when they burned, they could become laboratories of accidental heat. The same caution applies to glass found in deserts. Desert glass is especially seductive because it often appears in landscapes that already feel otherworldly. The Libyan desert glass found in the Great Sand Sea of western Egypt is one of the best-known examples. Pale yellow to greenish glass scattered across a vast, arid region. It has been studied for decades, and the leading explanations involve a high-energy natural event, most likely connected to a meteor impact or airburst, though details have been debated. What is important for our story is that nature itself can produce temperatures and pressures that leave glass behind. A meteor does not need mythology to be astonishing. It is already a cosmic event written into the ground. Lightning can do something similar on a smaller scale. When lightning strikes sand or soil, it can create fulgurites, branching tubes or irregular forms of fused material. These are sometimes called petrified lightning, and the phrase is almost too poetic to improve on. They are not evidence of ancient machinery. They are evidence of a natural electrical discharge concentrating energy into a narrow path. Fulgurites can look mysterious if one does not know what made them. Once understood, they remain mysterious in a different way because the ordinary sky has turned a patch of earth into glass. There are also volcanic processes. There are impact melts. There are ancient industrial residues. There are accidental fires in settlements where fuel, architecture, stored goods, and airflow combine to create unexpectedly intense heat. A burned building can generate conditions that vary wildly from one corner to another. One patch of floor may remain merely charred. Another may be reddened. Another may show fused clay or melted daub. Archaeology is full of such uneven traces because real fires are not clean laboratory events. They move, collapse, concentrate, suffocate, and flare. This is why the phrase vitrified sand should never be allowed to stand alone as proof of anything. The first question must be, where exactly was it found? In a sealed archaeological layer or lying loose on the surface? Was it collected by trained investigators or by someone repeating a claim from a photograph? What is its chemical composition? Does it match local sand, local industrial waste, nearby brick, furnace slag, or a natural glass? Has it been dated? If so, by what method? Is there a clear chain of custody? Is the vitrification widespread and patterned, or scattered and ambiguous? Does it occur with other signs of extreme destruction? Or is it being asked to carry the whole argument by itself? These questions may feel like they drain the romance from the object. In fact, they rescue it from being misused. A mystery becomes weaker when every strange material is forced into one grand explanation. It becomes stronger when each fragment is allowed to tell its own smaller, more precise story. A piece of slag near an ancient furnace is not disappointing. It is evidence of work, skill, heat, and economy. Desert glass born from an impact event is not a lesser wonder than a weapon. It connects human history to planetary violence on a scale no king could command. A vitrified wall may reveal a siege, a ritual burning, a structural accident, or an architectural choice that did not survive in written records. These explanations are not dull. They are simply less obedient to fantasy. The ancient nuclear war theory often depends on gathering unrelated phenomena into a single dramatic pattern. A line from an epic here, a glassy stone there, a ruined city somewhere else, a myth from another culture, an aerial chariot, a crater, a desert scar. A report repeated without its original source. Each element may be uncertain on its own, but placed together, they begin to look like a case. This is a common pattern in alternative history. The evidence gains strength not from depth, but from accumulation. The pile becomes persuasive because it is large, even if many of its pieces were never securely connected. That does not mean everyone who is intrigued by these claims is foolish. The instinct behind the fascination is understandable. We know that human beings are capable of losing knowledge. We know that civilizations collapse. We know that later generations misunderstand the remains of earlier ones. We also know, after the 20th century, that a single flash of human-made fire can alter cities, bodies, politics, and memory. Once the nuclear age entered the imagination, ancient descriptions of heat and light began to glow differently. So did glass in the desert. So did burned walls. The past was reread through the fears of the present. But archaeology asks for a slower kind of attention. It asks us to resist the thrill of resemblance. Something can look like the aftermath of a blast without being one. A surface can be fused without requiring a temperature beyond ancient capability. A legend can describe world-ending fire without preserving a technical eyewitness report. Similarity is the beginning of a question, not the end of an investigation. There is also a moral problem with misread evidence. When every unusual ruin becomes proof of a vanished super-civilization, The real achievements of ancient people are often diminished. Their crafts become impossible unless explained by lost machines. Their texts become valuable only when they seem to predict modern technology. Their disasters become interesting only if they resemble ours. This is a subtle form of disrespect. It takes the human past, with all its local intelligence and complexity, and turns it into a mirror for modern obsessions. The better approach is not to sneer at mystery, but to discipline it. Vitrified stone deserves study. Desert glass deserves wonder. Fused materials at archaeological sites deserve careful chemical and contextual analysis. Some cases will remain uncertain because the original conditions are gone. The excavation records are poor, or the material has been disturbed. Uncertainty should not be embarrassing. It is part of honest history, but uncertainty is not a blank space into which any story may be poured. What these glassy remnants teach us, in the end, is not that the ancient world possessed nuclear arsenals hidden behind mythic language. They teach us that heat leaves complicated signatures, and that interpretation can be as volatile as fire itself. A melted surface can preserve an event. It can also attract a legend. Between the two lies the patient work of asking what the object can actually bear. And sometimes, the most revealing thing about a piece of ancient glass is not the temperature that formed it, but the story we are tempted to see inside it. By the time the story reaches the Anunnaki, we have entered a different kind of landscape. Not the battlefield of Kurukshetra, not the golden city of Lanka, not the excavated streets of Mohenjo-Daro, where baked brick and drainage channels speak in the practical language of urban life. The Anunnaki belong, first and properly, to Mesopotamia, to Sumer, Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria, to temple hymns, royal inscriptions, creation stories, underworld myths, and the long, patient bureaucracy of clay tablets. And yet, in modern alternative history, they often appear somewhere else entirely. They are placed behind the wars of the gods, behind the flying vehicles, behind the weapons that shine like suns, behind the supposed ruin of ancient cities. They become the missing hand, the hidden engineer, the extraterrestrial power that turns myth into machinery and divine conflict into interplanetary warfare. It is a striking idea. It is also a very modern one. In the older Mesopotamian sources, the Anunnaki are not described as astronauts from another planet, conducting nuclear campaigns across the ancient world. The word itself refers to a group of deities, though its meaning and membership shift across periods and texts. Sometimes they are associated with the great gods, sometimes with the underworld. Sometimes they appear as a collective divine assembly, part of the sacred architecture of Mesopotamian religion. They belong to a world where the cosmos was governed by layered divine authority: sky, earth, waters, netherworld, kingship, fertility, storm, writing, judgment. They are not simple figures. Mesopotamian theology was not a single clean system frozen in time. It changed across cities, languages, dynasties, and centuries. A god's role in one text might differ in another. Names moved, functions overlapped. Divine genealogies could become political statements. To read these sources carefully is to enter a civilization where religion, law, agriculture, kingship, and cosmic order were woven together so tightly that separating them can feel like pulling threads from a living cloth. Modern myth-making usually does the opposite. It simplifies. It takes a divine name from one culture, a fiery weapon from another, a strange ruin from a third, and then draws a line between them as if distance itself were proof of a hidden map. The Anunnaki become a kind of universal explanation. If an ancient text speaks of gods descending from heaven, they must be astronauts. If a myth describes battle in the sky, it must be aerial combat. If a city declines, there must have been a catastrophic weapon. If an epic weapon burns too brightly for modern comfort, perhaps it was not a metaphor at all, but a memory of technology. This is how a religious tradition becomes a conspiracy architecture. The transformation did not happen in antiquity. It emerged much later, especially in the 20th century, when a particular cultural atmosphere made such theories feel newly persuasive. The atomic bomb had changed the human imagination. Spaceflight had moved from fantasy into engineering. Archaeology had revealed civilizations older and more complex than many popular histories had once allowed. At the same time, mass media had learned how to package mystery. Ancient statues, untranslated scripts, pyramids under dramatic lighting, questions posed in a tone that made caution seem almost boring. Into that world came the ancient astronaut reading of Mesopotamian myth. In this view, the gods of Sumer were reinterpreted not as gods in a religious or literary sense, but as technologically advanced visitors. Creation myths became genetic engineering. Divine kingship became colonial administration. Heaven became outer space. The sacred assembly became a command structure. And the Anunnaki, once embedded in temple religion and mythic cosmology, were recast as beings with motives closer to science fiction empires than ancient Near Eastern deities. The difficulty is not that ancient people never imagined beings descending from the sky. They did, in many cultures. The sky was divine territory. Storms came from above. Light came from above. Celestial bodies ordered time. To say a god descended was not a failed attempt to describe a spacecraft. It was often a theological statement about power entering the human realm. Modern readers, living after rockets, satellites, and military aircraft, hear descent differently. We translate the vertical language of sacred presence into the mechanical language of flight. That translation can be imaginative. It can even be fascinating. But it is not neutral. When the Anunnaki are pulled into ancient Indian war theories, the evidence becomes even thinner. The Mahabharata and Ramayana developed in a different linguistic, religious, and cultural world from Sumerian and Akkadian literature. They have their own cosmologies, their own gods, their own poetic systems, their own moral concerns. Divine weapons in Sanskrit epic are not presented as imported Mesopotamian devices. They are tied to tapas, mantra, dharma, lineage, and divine favor. Their power comes through spiritual discipline and cosmic authorization, not through alien manufacturers with hidden laboratories. That does not mean cultures never interacted across long distances. Ancient trade networks were real. The Indus world had contact with Mesopotamia. Goods, motifs, and ideas could travel farther than we sometimes imagine. But contact is not the same as a shared global war. A bead, a seal, a loanword, or a trade reference does not prove that the gods of one textual tradition were secretly the same beings as the gods of another, fighting with nuclear weapons across continents. This is where the modern myth becomes revealing. It often begins with a reasonable instinct. Ancient civilizations were more connected, more intelligent, and more technically capable than older stereotypes suggested. That instinct is worth preserving. The ancient world was not primitive in the casual sense. Mesopotamian mathematics, Indian grammar, Egyptian engineering, Chinese metallurgy, Maya astronomy. These were serious achievements of human thought and labor. But then the argument takes a strange turn. Instead of allowing ancient people their own brilliance, it sometimes hands their achievements to outsiders. The temple becomes a launch facility. The priest becomes a technician. The god becomes an astronaut. The epic poet becomes a confused witness to machines he could not understand. There is an unintended condescension hidden there. The theory appears to elevate antiquity, but often it does so by removing human authorship. It says, in effect, this was too grand, too strange, too complex, too imaginative, too powerful to have come from them. Someone else must have brought it. The Anunnaki connection also survives because it offers a satisfying narrative shape. It links scattered mysteries into a single drama. The Indian Astras, the Sumerian gods, the ruins of ancient cities, the myths of floods and celestial battles, the fear of lost knowledge, all of it can be folded into one enormous, forgotten war. And once that frame is accepted, every ambiguous detail becomes useful. A blazing weapon is no longer poetic excess. A divine chariot is no longer a royal symbol. A ruined site is no longer the result of climate, economy, flooding, abandonment, or ordinary violence. It becomes evidence. This is the danger of a theory that is too hungry. It can digest anything. If a text says the gods fought, it is read as war reporting. If a text speaks symbolically, symbolism is treated as camouflage. If archaeologists find no radiation, the absence becomes part of the cover-up or the loss of evidence over time. If engineers criticize the supposed aircraft designs in later texts, their objections are dismissed as narrow-minded. A closed theory does not need proof in the ordinary sense. It only needs enough fragments to keep the imagination moving. And yet, it would be too easy to mock the people drawn to these ideas. There is something deeply human underneath them. They arise from real questions. Why do so many cultures remember catastrophic destruction? Why do myths speak of gods with overwhelming weapons? Why do ancient texts sometimes sound uncannily modern? Why do civilizations rise to astonishing heights and then disappear into ruins? These questions deserve better than ridicule. They also deserve better than careless answers. The older Mesopotamian sources give us a world where humans are fragile before divine power, where kings must justify their authority, where cities stand under the protection and judgment of gods, where cosmic order can be disturbed by arrogance or violence. The Indian epics give us a world where warriors can acquire powers greater than their wisdom, where victory may leave moral wreckage, and where the use of ultimate weapons threatens not just enemies, but the fabric of life itself. These traditions do not need extraterrestrial factions to be profound. Their warnings are already severe. The modern Anunnaki war myth tells us less about Sumer than it does about ourselves. It is a mirror made from 20th century fears: nuclear fire, aerial bombardment, genetic science, empire, ecological collapse, secret technology, and the suspicion that official history has left something out. Once those fears became part of modern consciousness, ancient myths were reread through them. The gods began to look like pilots. Astras began to look like missiles. Sacred mountains became launch platforms. Heaven became a military theater. This does not prove that ancient nuclear war happened. It proves that modern people, standing under the long shadow of their own weapons, began to recognize their anxieties in older stories. And perhaps that is the more unsettling connection. Not that the Anunnaki came to India with advanced weapons. Not that Sanskrit epics preserve eyewitness accounts of alien battles, but that human beings, separated by thousands of years, keep imagining power descending from above, exceeding moral control, and leaving the earth wounded below. The names change, the fear remains familiar. By the time we return to the epics themselves, after all the modern claims have been weighed, nuclear blasts, radioactive ruins, Mercury engines, alien wars, something quieter begins to stand out. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are not careless stories intoxicated by destruction. They are not simply ancient spectacles where gods and warriors hurl impossible weapons across the sky because the poet wanted a larger explosion. Their battles may be immense, even cosmic in scale, but the deeper anxiety is rarely about power alone. It is about whether human beings can be trusted with power once they have learned to call it righteousness. That is the thread often lost in modern readings. When people go looking for lost technology, they sometimes pass too quickly over the moral architecture of the texts. The Astras are described as terrifying. Yes, their effects can sound immense, unnatural, even world-ending. But within the epic imagination, the greater danger is not that such weapons exist. The greater danger is that anger, pride, grief, or humiliation may summon them at the wrong moment. This is especially clear in the Mahabharata, a work that refuses to make war feel clean. It is full of heroic vows, sacred duties, divine interventions, and legendary warriors. Yet beneath that grandeur runs an almost relentless unease. The war at Kurukshetra is not presented as a simple victory of good over evil, at least not in the way a modern action story might handle it. The Pandavas win, but the victory is spiritually damaged. Families are broken. Teachers kill students. Students kill teachers. Brothers destroy cousins. The battlefield becomes a place where nearly everyone can claim some portion of justice, and nearly everyone is stained by what justice demands. That is one reason the weapon episodes matter so much. They are not technical footnotes. They are ethical pressure points. A warrior does not merely possess an astra like a soldier possesses a spear. In the epic world, a divine weapon is tied to discipline, initiation, mantra, restraint, and cosmic permission. It requires not only skill, but worthiness. This may sound mystical to us, but narratively it serves a very practical purpose. It makes the weapon a test of character. The Brahmastra and the Brahmashira are frightening not just because they can destroy. They are frightening because they reveal the state of the person who reaches for them. Ashwathama's use of the Brahmashira is one of the clearest examples. He is not calm. He is not acting as the ideal warrior, weighing necessity with discipline. He is wounded by loss, inflamed by revenge, and moving through the last convulsions of a war that has already consumed almost everything worth saving. When he unleashes that ultimate weapon, the epic is not inviting us to admire his arsenal. It is showing us what happens when a weapon meant for the gravest cosmic emergency falls into the hands of a man whose inner world has collapsed. Arjuna, by contrast, is also capable of invoking such a weapon. But the crucial difference is not merely that he knows the countermeasure. It is that he can withdraw it. In the moral logic of the story, the ability to call down destruction is incomplete without the ability to call it back. This is a profound idea, and it is easy to miss because modern conversations tend to focus on the destructive effect. But the epic places tremendous weight on restraint. Power that cannot be recalled is not mastery. It is surrender disguised as command. Here, the ancient text speaks with an almost unsettling relevance. Modern civilization has spent centuries admiring the ability to release force, faster, farther, with greater precision, with less immediate risk to the person giving the order. But withdrawal is a different kind of wisdom. Once certain kinds of violence begin, they enter the world with consequences no ruler, general, scientist, or priest can fully manage. The Mahabharata seems to understand this in symbolic form. It imagines weapons whose misuse does not simply defeat an enemy, but threatens fertility, lineage, the unborn future. That detail matters. The attack on the womb of Uttara, carrying the last heir of the Pandava line, is not just another act of cruelty. It shifts the meaning of warfare from killing bodies to attacking continuity itself. The future becomes the battlefield. Even if we do not read this as evidence of radiation, and there is no need to force that interpretation, the image is devastating in its own terms. A society at war may tell itself it is settling accounts with the present, but the damage travels forward. Children inherit the heat of decisions made before they were born. The Ramayana, though different in tone and structure, carries a related warning. Its world is more sharply shaped around ideals of kingship, loyalty, exile, devotion, and the restoration of order. Rama is no ordinary warrior. In many traditions, he is understood as an avatar of Vishnu, the divine entering history to restore Dharma. And yet even here, force is not treated as morally neutral. Ravana is not condemned simply because he is powerful. He is condemned because his power is severed from self-command. He is learned mighty, and in some traditions deeply ascetic. He has obtained boons, mastered arts, and ruled a splendid kingdom. But his greatness is poisoned by desire and arrogance. That is a recurring pattern in these epics. The most dangerous figures are not fools. They are often disciplined, gifted, even brilliant. Their failure is not a lack of capacity. It is a distortion of purpose. This may be one of the reasons modern theories about ancient superweapons cling so strongly to these stories. The texts themselves understand that knowledge can become monstrous when it is detached from humility. The divine weapons of the epics are therefore never just bigger arrows. They are extensions of a moral universe. A weapon associated with Agni, Varuna, Indra, Shiva, or Brahma is not simply a device with a special effect. It carries the weight of cosmic order. To use it improperly is not just bad strategy, it is a violation of the structure that gives the warrior his legitimacy in the first place. In that sense, the epics are less interested in technology as machinery than in technology as responsibility. This is where many modern speculative readings, however imaginative, flatten the older material. When an astra becomes only a missile, something is lost. When a Vimana becomes only an aircraft, something is lost. When a divine warning becomes only a garbled engineering report, something is lost. The mystery may become more sensational, but the story becomes smaller. That does not mean the technological comparisons are meaningless. They tell us something important about modern readers. After the 20th century, no one could read descriptions of blinding light, scorched earth, poisoned aftermath, and mass destruction in quite the same way. Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the imagination of catastrophe. The Cold War gave humanity a new vocabulary for fear, fallout, deterrence, mutually assured destruction, contamination, extinction. Once those ideas entered public consciousness, ancient apocalyptic imagery began to look strangely familiar. But resemblance is not identity. The fact that an ancient description reminds us of a nuclear blast does not mean the author witnessed one. It may mean that human beings, across time, return to similar images when trying to describe destruction beyond ordinary measure. Unbearable brightness, unnatural heat, broken bodies, ruined harvests, the sky itself seeming to turn against the earth. Ancient poets did not need particle physics to imagine the terror of a world made unlivable. Fire, drought, plague, famine, and divine wrath were already enough. What is remarkable is not that the epics secretly predicted modern weapons. It is that they understood the moral problem behind them. They knew that civilization depends on restraint more than strength. They knew that a warrior's discipline matters most when revenge feels justified. They knew that rulers often speak the language of duty while being driven by injury, pride, or fear. And they knew that victory can leave behind a silence no triumphal song can repair. The Mahabharata, in particular, resists the comfort of a clean ending. Yudhishthira does not emerge from war as a satisfied conqueror. He is burdened by the cost. The dead are not conveniently forgotten, so the winners can celebrate. The grief of women, parents, widows, and survivors is given moral force. The epic asks its audience to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that a war may be necessary within its own framework and still be catastrophic beyond measure. That is a subtler warning than simple pacifism. These texts come from cultures that understood kingship, warrior duty, and the use of force as part of worldly order. They do not always say that violence can be avoided. Sometimes they say the opposite, that refusing duty can also be a failure. But they are deeply suspicious of violence that becomes intoxicated with itself. They distrust the moment when a weapon is treated as proof of righteousness, rather than a burden requiring judgment. So perhaps the most important question is not whether the ancient world had nuclear arms hidden beneath mythic language. The evidence does not support that. The better question is why these stories still feel so modern when they describe the temptation to use unbearable force. The answer may be that the fear is older than the technology. Long before mushroom clouds, human beings understood that power could outrun wisdom. Long before missiles, they imagined weapons that should not be used except under the most extreme conditions. Long before modern states built arsenals capable of ending cities in minutes, poets and sages told stories about warriors who could summon devastation and then asked whether they had the right to do so. That is the warning still burning inside the epics. Not that our ancestors possessed machines we have forgotten, but that they recognized a danger we keep rediscovering. The true forbidden weapon is not merely the one that destroys a city. It is the certainty that convinces a person, a ruler, or a civilization that such destruction has become acceptable. And once that certainty takes hold, the battlefield is no longer only outside the gates. It is inside the human mind. SR 12. The ruins inside the imagination. By the end of this trail, the mystery has changed shape. At first, it seems to promise something almost cinematic. Ancient battlefields scorched by weapons brighter than the sun, flying machines crossing the skies of a vanished age, gods or beings from beyond the world fighting wars that left their traces in sand, stone, and scripture. It is a powerful image. It has the pull of a locked door. And like all good locked doors, it invites us to imagine that someone, somewhere, has hidden the key. But when we slow down, the picture becomes less like a buried technological record and more like a mirror. The ancient Indian epics do contain terrifying weapons. They do describe overwhelming light, heat, ruin, poisoned consequences, and fear on a scale that feels strangely familiar to a modern reader. The Mahabharata, especially, understands that warfare can cross a threshold where victory itself becomes morally meaningless. It imagines warriors standing before powers they are not wise enough to use. It gives us men who can summon destruction, but not always master themselves. That is not a small thing. In some ways, it is more disturbing than a simple claim of lost machines, because the evidence, taken carefully, does not support a literal ancient nuclear war. The passages often cited as proof belong to a literary, theological, and poetic world where divine weapons are not machines in the modern sense. Astras are invoked through mantra, discipline, and spiritual authority. Their force is inseparable from cosmic order, moral eligibility, and the burden of restraint. They are not described with the kind of technical consistency one would expect from engineering manuals. Their power belongs to the language of sacred warfare, not laboratory procedure. The same caution applies to the Vimanas. Flying palaces, celestial chariots, and royal vehicles moving through the air are not, by themselves, evidence of ancient aerospace technology. They reveal a deep human fascination with flight, sovereignty, divine mobility, and the freedom of gods and kings. Later attempts to convert that imagery into blueprints for aircraft tell us more about modern desires than ancient mechanics. The disputed modern history of texts, like the Vaimanika Shastra, makes this especially clear. A mystical and literary tradition was reimagined as lost engineering, and once that happened, every cloud chariot could be made to look like a machine. Mohenjo-Daro, too, has carried a legend heavier than the ruins themselves can bear. The city is real. Its sophistication is real. Its decline remains historically important. But the stories of radioactive skeletons, sudden nuclear annihilation, or vitrified remains proving atomic destruction do not stand up to archaeological scrutiny. The evidence points instead toward complex processes: environmental change, shifting rivers, flooding, social transformation, and gradual urban decline. These explanations may feel less dramatic, but they are not less profound. Civilizations rarely fall like buildings in a stage play. More often, they are worn down by pressures that accumulate until the old world can no longer hold its shape. And yet, dismissing the most extreme theories does not mean dismissing the unease that created them. The nuclear reading of ancient texts became especially tempting after the 20th century taught humanity what a sun-like weapon could actually do. Once the atomic bomb entered the imagination, older descriptions of divine fire began to look different. Words that once belonged to apocalypse, drought, plague, or cosmic judgment were reread through mushroom clouds and radiation sickness. Modern fear reached backward and found ancient language waiting for it. That is why these theories survive, even when the physical evidence is weak. They are not sustained only by facts. They are sustained by emotion, by suspicion, by wonder, and by the unsettling thought that our age may not be as unique as it believes. There is a strange comfort in imagining that others reached our level before us, lost everything, and left warnings behind. It turns our danger into a cycle, not an accident. It suggests that catastrophe has precedent. The Anunnaki connection works in much the same way. Mesopotamian deities, Indian epic weapons, aerial chariots, desert glass, and modern nuclear imagery are drawn into one enormous hidden war. The pieces come from different cultures, languages, eras, and symbolic worlds, but alternative history binds them together with the thread of technological secrecy. It is an impressive mythology of the modern age, not ancient religion exactly, not science fiction exactly, but something between them. What the older texts offer is quieter and perhaps more valuable. They do not need to have preserved memories of atomic devices to speak urgently to an atomic world. The Mahabharata already knows that power without wisdom becomes a curse. It knows that rulers can wrap ambition in sacred language. It knows that a weapon may be technically usable and morally forbidden. It knows that the deepest ruin begins before the battlefield, in pride, rivalry, humiliation, and the refusal to turn back. That may be the real secret hidden in these stories. Not Mercury engines, not extraterrestrial arsenals, not a forgotten nuclear age buried beneath the soil. The secret is that ancient minds were fully capable of imagining civilization destroying itself. They did not need uranium to understand irreversible violence. They did not need aircraft carriers to understand terror from the sky. They did not need radiation charts to fear poisoned earth and unborn generations paying for the rage of kings. So we are left with ruins of two kinds. There are the physical ruins, cities, fragments, burned surfaces, broken walls, and landscapes changed by time. These must be studied with discipline, not forced to confess to stories they cannot support. And then there are the ruins inside the imagination, the places where ancient memory and modern anxiety meet. That is where these theories live, not because they prove an ancient nuclear war, but because they reveal how deeply we fear becoming the ancestors of a future mystery. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is not that the ancients had our weapons. It is that they already understood our weakness.